NATO, France, European. This is our country. We live here, we die here.
Earlier on Thursday, forces loyal to Gaddafi launched new airstrikes on the eastern oil towns of Ras Lanouf and Brega. Rebel forces are reported to be retreating from Ras Lanouf. Well, Saif al-Islam's comments come after NATO's Secretary-General said the alliance plans to move warships to the Mediterranean in response to the crisis. NATO defence ministers are in Brussels, where they've been discussing possible military action in Libya. But Anders Fogh Rasmussen said NATO still needs a clear legal mandate to enforce a no-fly zone over Libya. France says it recognises the opposition National Council as the only legitimate representation of the Libyan people. Paris has also announced its intention to open a French embassy in the city of Benghazi, the seat of the Libyan uprising. We're getting reports that police have opened fire on protesters in Saudi Arabia, injuring at least one person. According to an eyewitness in the eastern city of Qatif, gunshots and stun grenades were fired at several hundred protesters as they marched through the streets on Thursday night. The city has been the scene of several protests over the last 2 weeks. There have also been calls on the internet for another day of protests on Friday. Alassane Ouattara says the African Union has endorsed him as the rightful leader of Côte d'Ivoire. He made the declaration at an African Union summit taking place in Ethiopia. It's the first time Ouattara has left Côte d'Ivoire since the political standoff began. The Dalai Lama has announced he'll be stepping down as political head of the exiled Tibetan movement. He says it's time for a freely elected leader to take over. China says the move is part of the Dalai Lama's plot to split the region. Those are the headlines. The news continues here on Al Jazeera after PLO, History of a Revolution.
In 1948, the State of Israel was proclaimed. Palestine was lost. 16 years later, in 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, was founded. Made up of different factions, the PLO has been at the heart of the struggle to regain Palestine ever since. By the end of the 60s, the Palestinians had become masters of their own destiny. But a bloody showdown was on the horizon. Not with Israel, but with fellow Arabs. The Palestinian Commando movement emerged as a force to be reckoned with in the region following the defeat of the Arab states in the 1967 war. The Palestinians had taken their first step towards emancipation from the Arab world.
All of these factors dealt a knockout blow to the Arab custodianship of the Palestinians and their cause, and thus Palestinians became the masters of their destiny.
The Palestinians took full advantage of the state of chaos suffered by the defeated Arab regimes. Palestinian guerrilla factions, the most prominent of which was Fatah, consolidated their grip on the refugee camps in the Arab world. Hundreds of fresh recruits enrolled to join these factions. The image of young Fidaiyin, or freedom fighters, clad in the traditional Palestinian headscarf, became an icon of resistance. Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser cast aside his initial misgivings and embraced Fatah. At the same time, he dissolved his traditional alliance with the Arab nationalist movement, a rival Palestinian faction to Fatah.
Nasser broke off his relationship with the Arab nationalist movement and adopted Fatah. Not only did he adopt Fatah, but he also took Arafat with him on a trip to Moscow.
I walked in and Nasser met me across the room. And lo and behold, the Soviet Troika got up, walked towards me and greeted me. The next day, they launched an official dialogue with me.
Other Arab regimes also vied for influence among the Palestinians as a way to gain leverage on the regional scene. Both Iraq and Syria encouraged the establishment of new Palestinian guerrilla factions allied to them. A declassified CIA document found that Fatah's independence had influenced Syria's decision to set up a Palestinian faction whose allegiance lay firmly with Damascus.
The Syrian government, unable to subvert Fatah for use as a political weapon, recently organized a group known as the Vanguard of the People's Liberation War.
But not all Arab states held the Palestinians in such high esteem. King Hussein was still reeling from the loss of the West Bank in 1967.
Israel's occupation of the West Bank effectively meant the loss of half the country. Imagine a person suddenly having to walk on one leg. That's why the 1967 war was such an earthquake for Jordan.
In Jordan, armed Palestinians strolled through the streets, enjoying freedom of movement and launching operations from Jordanian territory against Israel. Jordan began to view these attacks with increasing alarm. Nasser was assisting the Palestinians in training and arms, but he ensured that no operations were launched from Egyptian territory without stringent Egyptian control and coordination. Fatah and other Palestinian factions acted with much greater freedom within the weaker state of Jordan. In 1969, Palestinian commandos shot down a Lebanese army helicopter during clashes with the Lebanese state. An Egyptian brokered agreement known as the Cairo Accord put an end to the clashes. But the accord effectively legitimized the presence of armed Palestinian factions on Lebanese soil, something which was to have serious consequences for stability in Lebanon in the years to come. Besides creating waves in Arab regimes, the Palestinian factions also revolutionized their own society. In 1969, Fatah leader Yasser Arafat was elected chairman of the PLO. The election marked a new era. The guerrillas were in the ascendant, overthrowing the traditional hold of more established Palestinian families. Such was the impact of the PLO and the Fidaiyin that Arafat's image had made the cover of Time magazine. But it was in Jordan, the base for most of the Palestinian factions, where the Fidaiyin's growing assertiveness caused most problems. They had set up a state within a state in Jordan, and the actions they planned and carried out soon began to rock the region. Armed gunmen roamed the streets of the capital Amman and Jordan's other main cities like Irbid and Zarqa. Palestinian guerrillas no longer restricted themselves to bases in the more inaccessible parts of the country. Complaints about Palestinian excesses quickly mounted.
Between 1967 and 1971, there were more than 30,000 cases of lawlessness, from the throwing of hand grenades to premeditated murder. There were even attacks against His Majesty the King. All of this was tolerated with tremendous patience by His Majesty, because I think he felt a certain responsibility for the events of 1967. To his dying days, he felt it, especially the loss of Jerusalem.
King Hussein may have felt for the loss of Jerusalem and the West Bank in 1967, but his